Midnight on Earth podcast with your host, Jake Weaver. Engineered by Cedric Swan. Hey everybody, we are back with another episode of Midnight on Earth. I'm your host, Jake Weaver, and we're here to bring you more knowledge, more light, and more love, and more incredible guests. Gregory Shushan is here, and he's an incredible author. He's been around for a while. His name has been in the scene for a minute, as they say, and he has an incredible new book. It is called Near-Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations, the origin of the world's afterlife beliefs. Whoa, like, you know, this one's going to be heavy. This is going to be an incredible conversation, and we'll talk to Gregory in just a second. But first, I need you to do something for me. Follow me on Instagram at midnight_on_earth. That is the address. You can follow me there. Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, wherever you go to get your podcasts, click that button that connects us so you know exactly what is going on. When people like Gregory Shushan come on the show, you get that notification, you know instantly, and boom, you are here connecting with us. Lastly, tell a friend, tell someone that you know that loves these types of podcasts. You know these people, you know their frequency, you know where they're at energetically. Bring them here. midnightonearth.com. Okay, so we're almost talking to Gregory, but we have to read his bio, so here we go. Gregory Shushan, Ph.D., is the leading authority on near-death experiences and afterlife beliefs across cultures and throughout history. He is an award-winning author affiliated with Birmingham Newman University, University of Winchester, Marian University, and the Parapsychology Foundation. A former researcher at the University of Oxford and University of Wales, he currently lives in San Francisco, and he's with us today. Hello, Gregory.
Hey, Jake. How are you doing?
I'm doing incredible, especially after reading your book, your latest book. It's so informative, intensely informative. There's so much good information there. It is absolutely amazing.
Thanks. I appreciate it.
And it seems to be the culmination of all of your works. Now, let's start with telling people how you got so focused on this concept, near-death experiences, and then ancient near-death experiences. How did this all begin for you?
Sure. In a way, it's the origin and the culmination of all my work, because this book is where it all started, but then this version of it is totally new and rewritten and updated and made more accessible to a wider audience. It started out as like a small press academic work. It was based on my thesis, but so I was able to revisit it all these years later and basically entirely redo it. So I was able to also look at it with the benefit of hindsight from my later work, which kind of helped to, as you say, make it a culmination of all my work.
So are you saying this is a re-release of a previous work?
It is in a way, but it's really a new big book because the original one was a small academic press in 2009, based in the UK. It was $125.
Okay.
The structure was different, right? I mean, it's the same. Actually, what I would say is it's the same material, updated, rewritten, revised, and
expanded upon. Yeah.
It's the director's cut.
Wow. It's incredible. So, like, why NDEs? Did you have an NDE? Like, what attracted you to this?
I didn't know. I grew up kind of being interested in, well, various things. My mom was kind of the hippie generation, and she wrote her MA thesis on William Blake and the psychedelic experience, for example.
Okay.
I had an aunt who was a Rosicrucian, and my mom was also interested in like Hinduism and Buddhism, and we had Jewish relatives and Catholic relatives. So it was kind of this, I was born to be a historian of religions in a way.
Yes, it was all right there. The whole world culture, the diaspora, as they say.
Exactly, yeah. But at the same time, because wasn't raised with like a particular religion myself or a particular dogma, I sort of looked at all the supernatural, paranormal stuff as the same kind of thing. This is like weird things that happen to people and weird things that people believe. So, when I started hearing about near-death experiences, initially it was like the same as, ghosts or UFOs or Bigfoot or whatever. But there was something specific about NDEs that really kind of as with a lot of people, it really fired my imagination because it happens in this context of somebody apparently dying or being temporarily dead or almost dying, and then having experience when they, physically should not be, and then come back to life and tell about these experiences. So that really just kind of, to me, that seemed like that's a different kind of experience than all this other, paranormal phenomena that you'd watch on, In Search of or whatever when you're a little kid.
Right.
So
Because these people were bringing back data, essentially. They were bringing back information from that other place, whether it's a dimension, a realm, whatever it's described as. There was
yeah,
some information collection, storage, and then bringing back to then expound to people.
yeah, yeah. And then, it very quickly kind of entered the popular imagination with movies like Flatliners and things like that.
Right.
Um, but I came across a book called Otherworld Journeys by Carol Zaleski, and she looks at NDEs in relation to medieval afterlife journeys of monks and nuns, medieval European. And that planted another seed because I thought, okay, this is not just like a modern Western New Age kind of phenomena. It's not just a modern Western psychological phenomenon. If people in the medieval Europe were having them,
Right.
something's going on. So then, fast forward a little later, and I was researching. I was doing my first degree was in Egyptian archaeology at the Institute of Archaeology in London, and I was reading the descriptions of the afterlife in texts like the Coffin texts and Pyramid texts and Book of the Dead. And I was noticing that if you kind of strip away all of the cultural expressions of their beliefs and look at them as just like almost as if they're symbols, they were really similar to NDs. So, just for example, the soul leaves the body at death, travels through darkness to another world, meets a being of light, who, in the case of Egypt, is the sun god Re, meets their deceased relatives and ancestors, has a kind of review of their life, an evaluation of their deeds on life in order to kind of figure out what's going to happen next, the next phase of the afterlife. And in Egypt, there's also an interesting thing. This is an example of the way they symbolize these concepts. So the idea of the soul leaving the body and near-death experiences report seeing their body below, like either on the hospital room, on the cardiac arrest table, or
Right.
at the accident site or whatever. In Egypt, there's this moment of the soul's journey to the afterlife where they enter this deep, dark area of the underworld called Rosetau. And in that area is the corpse of Osiris. And the text explains this is an encounter with your own corpse. You are Osiris. So I took that as a kind of
Wow.
symbolic description of an out-of-body experience and of seeing the corpse. And what's interesting about that is thematically what happens in both NDEs and in that text, it's that recognition that enables the person to move on to the next stage of the afterlife. So when somebody has the NDE and they see their corpse, they think, wait a minute, I'm still
Yeah.
conscious, but that's me. I'm dead, but I'm still alive. So it's that realization of survival after death that kind of enables the next step. So that
Right.
was the kind of origin of how all this first came about.
Wow. So you saw the parallels there. You saw how it could be just a symbol because, truthfully, if you do the deep dives, you study these things, you do see that so many of these spiritual traditions or understandings are symbolized with symbols. They're
Right.
collected with symbols. So you see these motifs essentially throughout the NDE experience and the Egyptian death experience, and you're just making connections there. This is even before the other cultures.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And I should stress too that these texts are not, a personal narrative of somebody who died and came back to life. There's no, they're basically the guidebooks to the afterlife
Right.
for the mummy that's going into the tomb. But the implication, obviously, is that where did they get that information? Somebody must have been there to come back and write about it, because how else would they know? So that, and I thought, like, as far as they're concerned, these texts might have been based on genuine experiences of the afterlife. And I thought there is a type of experience that we know of that could account for that. And these symbolic expressions of the journey are all in these texts. So then I thought, how far can I take this argument? How can I test it, basically? Because if we don't have descriptions of NDEs, we only have descriptions of the afterlife. How is this testable? So I looked at five other civilizations around the world: ancient Sumer in Mesopotamia, ancient China before Buddhism, India before Hinduism, kind of Vedic period was like the roots of Hinduism, and then in Mesoamerica, the Aztec and the Maya. And mostly it was about their afterlife beliefs specifically. But in most of them, I also found actual descriptions of near-death experiences, which, hadn't really been recognized in near-death studies before.
Yes, it's very profound, actually. And yes, you do focus on those five areas, though you do point out in your book that there are more. There are other cultures with those same stories. These are just the ones that you focus on. These were the biggest kind of impact cultures, you can say, in world history. And they have this rich spiritual tradition. They also have these stories, like you said, that have never really surfaced unless you're a part of that specific tribe or you are focused on the history of studying that ancient history of those areas. Then you come across these stories. You found these stories and were able to filter them through your understanding of the near-death experience and how it all interrelates. I mean, that must have been mind-blowing for you. Once the connections started showing up, it must have indicated something even before that.
Yeah, because I went into it thinking, I'm willing to be proven wrong, and I'm willing to kind of go where the evidence leads. And if the Vedic afterlife is totally different and the Chinese afterlife is totally different, and there's no relation to NDEs, fine, I'll write that up too, and it'll be a short article instead of turning it into a life's work. But it was the case that I just kept finding one parallel after another, and then like with India, for example. I discovered that there was this kind of continuous tradition of these other world journey stories going way back to the Rig Veda and all the way through to the Upanishads and a little bit beyond. But at a certain point, they started focusing more on reincarnation after the Upanishads. And that's when the NDE accounts kind of taper off, which is interesting because it means the culture is, dictating what's relevant and what should be expressed and what shouldn't. But that's also a good example of, when I first did this research, there was no translation of the Rig Veda in its entirety in English, no like solid academic translation. In between, a gigantic 3-volume translation of the Rig Veda came out in English. So I combed through that with a fine-tooth comb and basically had to rewrite that entire chapter, and found a lot of more stuff that I had no idea existed. For example, there's an NDE of a horse in in the Rig Veda,
Right.
which so yeah, I mean it was a case of the more I searched, the more I found.
Wow. And again, that the interconnectedness of all of it must have been life-changing for you because you can see this other narrative. Of course, it's expressing itself in relation to the cultures that are interfacing with it. But above that, there's just some other force, you could say, that's designing all of that, that's creating that near-death experience for all of these people to have their different analogs of it. But the core experience is real. It was there. That must have been huge when you had that revelation.
Yeah, and actually what I should just mention a little piece of the way I went about it. My methodology was the reason I selected those particular civilizations was because they are the world's earliest expressions of afterlife beliefs anywhere.
Okay.
There is nothing earlier than the Egyptian Sumerian. And I mean that in the sense of obviously the Aztec and Mayan are much later than the Egyptian, but within that world area, they had no contact with the Egyptians or Chinese or anybody else. They grew organically in that particular spot, from the Olmec and other
Sure.
ancient civilizations. So, so there was no real possibility that an afterlife story from Egypt would radiate out to the rest of the world. No, that just didn't happen because of the independence of all these cultures. So to me, that was a big part of it because it just showed uh, that kind of eliminates one argument that people would come up with.
Right. They were
When
isolated.
there's
There's no
cross.
cross pollination. They're totally
Exactly.
isolated. They're developing like islands of consciousness.
Exactly. Yeah. So then, where else do we look to explain all these similarities? Do we look at, people think about these things in similar ways? The mind creates myths in the same ways. And to which that I would answer, well, creation myths are very different cross-culturally, and there's no, different gods are all different cross-culturally. So it was really like this very specific. I isolated like 9 elements of the NDE that were present in all of these civilizations, and I just thought like um, why not look at the NDE as the source of the beliefs if they really do have all these elements in common, which they do. So
Right. And the 9 elements, I made some notes here. They are the OBE, and correct me if I'm wrong, OBE, and then a knowledge enlightenment phase, judgment and life review, some dangers and perhaps some perils, other realms, and then transcendence. Is that about right? Did I take my notes right?
right, yeah, that and then also as part of the OB, the seeing the body.
Oh, yes. The
Yeah,
recognition of the physical detachment, essentially
yeah,
seeing the fact that you have carried on beyond the physical.
right, yeah, and also the deceased relatives. I don't know if you mentioned that. That
Oh,
was another
yes, the
pretty common
ancestors, the
one.
relatives.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this idea of ancestors and relatives being in these other realms and then the process of reincarnation. I still haven't like come to an understanding with that yet because
Yeah.
you go to these places. So many NDE survivors talk about this. You go to these places, you see your ancestors, your aunt, your uncles, the ones that have passed on,
Mhm.
and they're there. And yet we're taught by all the greatest spiritual traditions around the world that you have a soul's journey, a soul's path. You're reincarnating until you hit that higher next plane. How do those two exist?
That's a great question. Often it's a case of that the afterlife realm is like an intermediate state. It's where the soul goes between this life and before the next life. So you spend a period of time figuring out what's going to happen next, reviewing what already happened in your previous life, and kind of grounding your your base element. What they would call in Hinduism is the Atman, the inner unchanging self, the thing that was you and is going to be the next you. Um, and there's actually evidence for this in cases of children who remember past lives.
Right.
They do, the research at University of Virginia and a few other places. There are quite a few cases. I talk about this in one of my other books, The Next World, where there are cases where children who remember their past lives also remember the death of their previous life, of their previous personality, and they remember the dying process. And the way they describe that is exactly like an NDE. They'll say, when I was so and so in my other life, I was run over by a truck, and I remember leaving the body. I saw my body lying there in the road. I went to another realm. I met a being in a robe or shining light or whatever. Um, and I met my deceased relatives. The only difference is that being the process from then on is we need to figure out where you're going to go next. Either you're going to choose your next body and your next family, or it's chosen for you by this being or some other unknown process. Whereas in an NDE, you'd go back to your former body of your current life. Um, but it's really interesting to me that even in cultures that believe in reincarnation and children who report these cases report these very NDE-like experiences because that's exactly what we would expect.
So this is a natural process based on everything that you've discovered. I mean, tens of thousands of years of history, modern accounts, it seems to be a natural process. However, would you agree that there are aspects of it that take the form of the culture that the person is involved in order to create a more comfortable experience?
Yeah, absolutely. All of that. First, I like the way you called it a natural experience rather than like it's always presented in terms of supernatural or paranormal or something
No.
weird. And it's like I think if it really is evidence of the soul surviving death, that's just what happens. It
Right.
doesn't even necessarily mean that there's a God. It doesn't mean anything other than your consciousness survives the death of your body. How that happens, we're not sure. If it happens, we're not totally sure, but it seems, there's some good evidence for it. But yeah, and absolutely too, that the experience would definitely be colored by your cultural and individual makeup and your programming and your perception, the kinds of symbols that you're used to in whatever culture you come from. Because I mean, if you think about it, like everyone's so different on Earth, and
Sure.
even in Life After Life, Raymond Moody's the first Western modern book about NDEs 50 years ago was published in 1975. Even then, he said, here are like the basic 15 elements of an NDE, but I have found no example of an NDE that includes all 15 elements. It's more like this, repertoire that people, you know, have a few of those experience, 5 or 10 or whatever. But then even within that, they definitely experience them in their own individual symbolic sort of way.
Right. There are cultural variations, there are individual variations, just literally based on the person's life experience. But then there are parts of it that are totally archetypal. They're written
Yeah.
into the universal design, and they seem to, like we were saying, take a very personal form when dealing with each individual soul as it crosses over. That's huge.
Yeah. Yeah. I look at it as like there's 3 layers or 3 elements or components to an NDE. There's like this universal thematic layer, which is just like the NDE itself and the context of dying and returning and all that. And then there's the sort of layer below that is each element, like leaving the body, traveling to the other world, meeting the deceased relatives. And then there's like the personal and symbolic level, which is how the person experiences each of those experiences, basically.
Wow.
So just to give one example, the kind of Western stereotype of getting to the other world is traveling through a dark tunnel with a light at the end,
Right.
and you kind of emerge into this bright light. But like in some Polynesian societies, like in Hawaii, they describe walking along a path, and they will even say, "I looked down and I could see the footprints in the sand of the souls who had gone to the other world before me." And there's one example of a woman who says, "I saw another soul returning on the path the opposite way, going back to their body."
Oh,
So
wow.
she's on her way to having an NDE and she sees somebody on the way back. But I mean, essentially, it's the same thing of, traveling from here to the other world during this temporary death state. It's just that it's walking along a path instead of speeding through a tunnel. Because
Right.
that's what makes
Right.
symbolic sense to somebody in that culture.
Yes, absolutely. And culturally, it seems like, and based on your book, that NDEs, people experiencing NDEs in ancient times, shamanic NDEs, and all of these other experiences similar to that seem to have influenced how these ancient cultures developed their spiritual systems, their religious systems, their social systems, all seem to be pieced together from these fragments of information that came from that other place.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a good summary of that. And you mentioned shamanism. I think NDEs I think shamanism was probably a response to NDEs in a way because NDEs happen spontaneously.
Right.
It's not like a practice that brings them about. So I think the way I kind of imagine it is that people had NDEs and the prophets or religious holy people in the society thought, how can we access that without dying, basically, and maybe through
Okay.
meditation and different kinds of experimentation and altering consciousness, different kinds of practices with repetitive drumming and dancing and psychological techniques and drug use. They developed these ways of having an analogous experience, basically. And some of that was specifically for what they call soul retrieval, which is, for all intents and purposes, it's the shaman going to the other world and saving somebody who's having an NDE and bringing their soul back to their body. So
Oh,
again, an acknowledgement of an NDE within the culture, even if they don't have a word for for near-death experience.
Holy cow. Can you imagine if that was your job as the tribal shaman and, there's
Yeah.
a woman emotionally pleading with you, her daughter's dying. They're like, look, we need you to go to the other dimension and go get her back, please. And
Yeah.
that's, wow, what a job.
Yeah.
That must have been so intense
Yeah.
because you would need to find the components that would simulate a near-death experience, but of course, not kill you, right? In order to
Exactly.
go to those places. Now, it's talked about how the brain releases DMT, dimethyltryptamine, when you die. And in
Right.
situations like when people are taking ayahuasca, that's a DMT situation. They're going to those same places. Is DMT the biological component, the gateway to these NDEs?
I don't think it is. No, I think,
Okay.
I mean, maybe it is a thing that helps to kind of trigger the experience. Maybe it's a catalyst or it helps it along. But from what I understand, it's not really my area, but from what I understand, people who have DMT experiences, um, they might say, there are similarities in this way or that way. For example, even Alexander, he doesn't think that his near-death experience was the same as his DMT experiences. Some people describe it in more in NDE-like terms. But one thing that I found compelling was people who have the DMT experience, they will be convinced that it was real. They might say, these other dimensional entities I saw were absolutely real. They communicated with me, they touched my soul or whatever. They'll have all these convictions of the experience, similar to people who have NDEs. But those who have DMT experiences, like a year later or 2 years later, they'll start thinking, I'm not sure about that. I think it was probably just the drug. Whereas people with NDEs, that stays with them their entire life. They're convinced by it for the rest of their lives, and it remains vivid.
Absolutely. I mean, their consciousness was there sensually, all their senses, I mean, their whole self was in that place. It's really interesting. I think about it occasionally because it does come up. There is two types of DMT, the NN-DMT, which is synthetic, and then the 5-MeO-DMT, which is the kind that's in our brain and found throughout nature. Perhaps the people that are experiencing with the NN are thinking they're going to that place and maybe the 5-MeO could simulate that. Who knows? It's all conjecture, but it is proven that that does release at the time of death.
Right. Have you talked to Pascal Michael about that?
Not yet, but I have a feeling I will.
Yeah, he's your guy for sure. Because he did some pretty rigorous research on that at University of Greenwich in the UK.
Okay.
With David Luke was involved too, so you might know him. But yeah, I think he's their work is kind of on the cutting edge of that question.
Yeah, it's really
and he also brought in the cross-cultural stuff, so it was a pretty rigorous study.
I'll have to look into that. Thank you for the heads up on that. But with the NDEs that you found, some of them, most of them seem to be positive in nature. Some are negative. I've had a guest on the show. My first NDE guest, she talked about how she had an NDE. She went to hell, which she described as hell, and she was being assaulted by all these demons. It was just the most gruesome situation you can even imagine. But then she prayed to Jesus, and then she was lifted out of that hell into a heaven scenario with Jesus and all of those other entities in the Christian situation before she came back to this world. Is it self-created based on your own beliefs about the choices you've made? Is there some component of the NDE that's influenced by guilt, resentment, things like that?
I think there is, or at least there can be.
Okay.
I think your psychological state will definitely impact it. And that's why, like, a lot of these, I mean, one of the main things in these societies, as far as, ritual traditions involving death and dying in Tibetan Buddhism, in ancient Greece, lots of traditions, it's like a practice for dying in order to learn how to consciously die, basically. So you can recognize things like, okay, these demons that are dragging me down are creations of my mind. If I change my focus to a being of light or some kind of deity, then maybe that's going to uplift me out of that. And then maybe if I can change my focus from the deity being external to being like part of myself, I can overcome the cycle of rebirth. So it's basically this knowledge and consciousness through the dying process that I think, it is a core teaching cross-culturally.
Oh, absolutely. And I think that that's really giving people an understanding that there is something bigger than themselves, even if they
Mhm.
put it through a cultural filter or a religious filter. At the very least, they're left with the understanding that there's something more than this world, and we have to try to understand what that is. And I think that with your book, you've really taken the deep dive on this and shown how all of these cultures, the ones that you've outlined, have really focused on NDEs and how they have all been integral parts of their culture.
Right. Yeah, and I think also as far as negative NDE or distressing NDEs goes, um, I guess there's a couple points about that. From the studies that have been done, they don't seem to have the same cohesion as the more typical type of NDEs. Like there's not like a set description of what all shared features of what negative NDEs have. Some people describe them as like this kind of shadowy, threatening, horrific thing. Some people describe the same elements of a regular NDE, but see them as threatening. So like the speeding through the tunnel is like horrific, and the being of light is scary. So and that I think speaks to the psychological impact. And then looking at the ancient texts, all of them have some kind of idea of a threat in the afterlife. And again, they're very much determined by the culture. So in Egypt, there was this terror of annihilation. It was a positive thing to merge with the sun god and be one with the deities, but to be annihilated was like the ultimate horror.
Oh,
So there's lots and lots of descriptions of, being killed in the abyss and things like that. Then there's also very specific things like female apes that will cut off your head if you can't avoid them. Um, so these are very obviously you're not going to find that in Mexico or some other culture that doesn't have apes.
right.
And so there and then crocodiles and so so there's environmental influence as well. But I have wondered
Interesting.
like if some of those negative descriptions are grounded in fearful elements of NDEs that people might have overcome at a certain point.
I think so. I mean, you think of what you just described as disintegration is just like that hell situation of,
Yeah.
Abrahamic religions. It's just like everybody talks about elevation or disintegration in some form, again, like you
Yeah.
said, in a symbolic way. But what are some of the things that you feel like are not as noticed, but exceptionally powerful when it comes to these ancient NDEs?
One of them is definitely that corpse encounter thing I mentioned. That
Right.
that seems to be in near-death studies. Normally, it's just kind of seen as a component of the out-of-body experience. It's not normally like isolated, but over and over, I found this idea of, like I mentioned earlier, that acknowledging that you're outside of your body, but you've survived your own death. That's a really powerful thing. Seems to be cross-culturally, and it's expressed symbolically in different cultures. In China, there's an encounter with the corpses of gods, and I think that's another thing. Like you are one of these people. You've transcended. You've reached this divine state, and you're one of these corpses, but you've also survived consciously being one of them.
Wow.
Um, so that, and I think also it's difficult to avoid overgeneralizing, and that's something I really try to do in the book. As you've probably noticed, I try to really respect like the similarities, but also the differences.
Right. Yes.
But this idea of transcendence and enlightenment and afterlife knowledge and wisdom, and that seems to be pretty much universal. The afterlife is a place of renewal and wisdom and mostly positive transformational effects. So,
Right. So do you feel like all of this knowledge changed how you personally view the world? Do you see yourself as an eternal being?
oh wow, that's a loaded question. I mean,
Like
as
a light
a
being, as a being going through the process. Gregory now, but perhaps someone else or some other thing next.
yeah, I mean, I don't want this to sound like a cop out, but basically, I tried to like occupy a space in the middle of the argument. So, there's this medieval Christian book called The Cloud of Unknowing, spiritual book, and I that's kind of what I feel like. I dwell in the cloud of unknowing because I don't, like I said, I didn't have, I wasn't raised with any religion, so I don't really understand belief on a personal level. I feel like there are things I know and there's things I don't know.
Hmm.
Um, so things I know, I think, are like things in this book where I put these ideas together and came up with this structure for understanding them and explaining them. I feel like that's knowledge, the cross-cultural diversity of NDEs and all that. But what they actually mean, if I really, if one of those cultures is more correct than another as far as like the nature of the soul or the nature of the afterlife, that's kind of where I think I'll find out when I get there.
Right. Well, do you have a plan? Have you thought about your own personal plan? Like, what if you see the light? What are you going to do? Some people actually say run away from the light. Some people say run towards the light. There's so many conflicting opinions. You could say 'cause nobody
Yeah.
really knows. Only some people know. Do you have any idea? Like, what do you think? What are you going to do?
Uh, I think I would probably think, okay, I know that in some cultures, this light is like Jesus or Muhammad or the Buddha, but I also know that it's seen as an illusory thing in Tibetan Buddhism, the clear light of pure reason. And if I can acknowledge that, maybe I can get off the cycle of rebirths. I mean, nirvana is attained by very few people, but maybe because I've been doing this for so long, I would be one of those that I'd be able to recognize that, or at least I'd be able to make a conscious decision of you know, I would understand what my options are and then be able to make a decision from there. I think
Right.
that's probably the best anyone can hope for, ra- rather than just kind of giving up to like, okay, whatever's going to happen, I'm going to go through this, as a passive person rather than
Right.
somebody who's participating in
Oh
it.
yeah, you're gonna be in it, making choice. You're gonna be blown away. You're like, oh, they were right about that.
Yeah, yeah, and I also talk about in the book that there's an element to the afterlife that might be similar to a lucid dream, I think, where
Yes,
it's
yes.
yeah, where it's, I mean, just in case anybody doesn't know, a lucid dream is where you're dreaming, but you're conscious of the fact that you're dreaming within the dream. And people who get really good at it can start kind of manipulating the environment. If you run across, a demon or a monster, you can slay them, or you can, in some traditions, you give them a gift, and then they kind of disappear and make friends with them. So I think it's kind of a good model for looking at some of this that there's this kind of background dream reality going on, but you're able to influence it and you perceive it in a way that is specific to your culture and your upbringing.
Right. You can make choices. Things happen much like a lucid dream. It's really mind blowing, actually. And one fact that I noticed in your book is that 10% of people who almost die have these near death experiences. And that's a
Right.
lot of people. You start
It
crunching the
is.
numbers, that's a lot of people.
Yeah, it is a lot, but then it also begs the question of why aren't 90% of the people having
Mm,
NDEs? So
that's the
um,
other good point.
whether that's a biological thing, some their brain isn't releasing whatever needs, DMT, or it's a psychological thing where they're not letting go, or who knows? I mean, that's one of the many mysteries that's still surrounding near-death experiences. And every few months there's a new article in Scientific American or something where they claim to have explained what NDEs are, and none of them have.
No, of course not. I
So
mean, come on. You know the humans. We always think we're right until we realize
yeah.
we're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. And actually, I'm hoping that my work will make an impact, not just in history of religions and, individual spirituality or whatever, but like in the wider near-death studies world, because, we have these scholars. Like last year, there was this study where they got this new EEG reading of a guy in the process of dying. And they were able to see that there was this burst of electricity at the moment of death. And then they found, oh, this replicated what they had observed in rats a couple years earlier, that I guess mammals in general have this burst of brain activity when they die. So scientists said, okay, this is a near-death experience, and that burst of brain activity is the life review because it's all of the barriers in the human brain coming down and flooding your consciousness with all the memories you had, and then you're going to die completely and be snuffed out. The problem with that is cross-culturally, that kind of panoramic life review where we were flooded with all of our memories at once is practically non-existent. So there's some kind of like evaluation of your previous life There's a great example, a Native American example, where the person having the NDE sees a picture of himself on a wall during the NDE, and that picture somehow like embodies everything he had done in his previous life, but we don't know how. It's not like a panoramic life review. So
Wow,
you know
that's huge. I mean, we've
the
become
point of that, yeah,
yeah,
the
that's
point is
huge.
like if the burst of brain activity is responsible for a life review, why aren't people in other cultures having it? We all have the same physiological brain system.
Right.
So it's a challenge to some of those arguments about, the dying brain hypothesis.
Yes, but I've also heard recently that chameleons, when they die, they change color rapidly, very rapidly into
Oh,
all these
wow.
different colors, seemingly having a past life review. Isn't that
Wow.
amazing?
That is, yeah.
You'll have to look into that one. I can't believe you didn't know that. That's amazing.
Yeah, I
We
didn't know
enlightened you a
that.
little bit here.
I don't know how they would test that to know what's going on in the chameleon's mind. I don't know if we have that technology yet, but
Yeah, not yet.
that's amazing.
It is pretty mind blowing to think about that. Like perhaps
Mhm.
even all the creatures on this great planet, the humans, the animals, all of these conscious beings are having some sort of archetypal experience, not even depending on their biology. That
Yeah,
would be even another layer. That would be
yeah,
so unbelievable.
yeah. Well, I mentioned the near-death experience of the horse in
Right,
the big data.
exactly.
So, so they were on that path of thinking, I think.
Exactly.
And whether that was somebody, who knows, was that a shaman or an NDE or who actually encountered a spirit horse in the other world? Maybe so.
Perhaps, but there are books, there are ancient texts that you outline in your book that seem to give us guidance, and some seem to align very closely with the NDEs that people have experienced throughout history. Tell us
Mhm.
about those books and which ones that you feel like are the most authentic or have the most truth to them.
Wow. I guess one that resonated with me the most um, might be the Upanishads from India, and also the Zhuangzi from China, which used to be transliterated as Chung Su. Um, to me, in my mind, they're kind of similar. They're very mystical texts. A lot of them are kind of about what's going on in the consciousness, very specifically. Um, about that rather than any kind of external things. There's no like system of gods or devils or judgment or gates or tunnels. I mean, all this kind of symbolic descriptions are kind of missing from a lot of these texts. It's really like this kind of pure expression of how I would conceptualize what's happening in your consciousness in death, stripped of some of that cultural overlay. So to me, they're also really poetic and just kind of beautiful and moving to read. But at the same time, probably more open to interpretation and a bit more abstract, I guess.
Yes, I often hear people refer to the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the bardos that people go through the different layers or dimensions of the death experience. Do you feel like it's just really cultural, like the bardos, the other cultures have different versions of that? It's really just culturally specific?
Yeah, I mean, I think that system that the Tibetans came up with makes a lot of sense. And, the bardos are basically intermediate states. So that would
Right.
explain what we were talking about earlier with the children who remember past lives and the state that an NDE goes to, and that these temporary reincarnation state people go to is the same as the bardos, basically. It's this intermediate realm. And they described the dying process in the Tibetan Book of the Dead very similar to NDEs. So they really did seem to know, to be writing from knowledge of that experience. There are, of course, and they also were very clear that the things they were describing were cultural manifestations of these things. So the book actually teaches look beyond the cultural symbolism that you're going to be experiencing. That's why they talk about when you see the clear light of pure reason, it's a clear light of pure reason. It's not the Buddha. It's not Jesus. It's not Muhammad.
Right.
So yeah, it's this transcendence of the process. That's mostly missing in the ancient texts, except maybe from the Zhuangzi and the Upanishads. Although they do all of them also have this transcendent kind of element. Even going way back to the Egyptian one, there's this idea of merging with the sun god. You already are the sun god, merging with the god of death, but you already are the god of death. So it's kind of like recognize your own divinity, recognizing your own transcendence. Um, but it's also kind of staying apart from it and retaining your own
Individuation.
capacity. Yeah, yeah, and your capacity for experience and individual consciousness. That seems
Right.
to be pretty common in all of these texts too.
So does it seem like then there is a longer system where people retain individuation for several cycles before they merge with the Godhead or Buddha or whatever it's described as? They merge with that or merge with the God of death. Is there then intermediary points where there's different dimensions, different type of beings? It's just, there's so many implications.
Yeah, and I mean, again, staying with Egypt for an example, um, there there's the field of rushes they call it, or the marsh of offerings. There's the underworld called the Duat, which is actually described as the under sky. It's like the sky below the earth. And the soul of the dead is traveling with the sun god Re, while also being the sun god Re, going through the heavens and then going through the underworld, where they are also the underworld god Osiris. But at the same time, they're described as dwelling in these paradise kind of realms like the field of offerings. So whether all that's happening at once, like this omniscient, omnipresent kind of experience where you literally have transcended everything and you're doing all these things at once, whether it's that or whether you travel to that field of rushes and stay there for a while and then continue going, it's really hard to say because they're all kind of depicted as eternity.
Right.
So, earlier scholars, and actually occasionally you still see it, they would say, it's obvious that the scribes didn't know what they were talking about. They were just writing about, whatever came into their heads. Or they would say, this is a merging of two traditions, North and South, and they don't quite gel, but they stuck them all in these texts anyway. I don't think that's the case because this is a civilization that lasted for, over 3,000 years. And I think that there was some kind of internal cohesion. This stuff made sense to the people who were conducting these rituals and having these beliefs for thousands of years. So I think the fault is in our own understanding. And that's unfortunately the case with all of these ancient civilizations. There's only like a certain degree to which we can understand them, especially Sumer, the ones that are, there's no longer anybody who's continuously part of these cultures.
Right.
With the Vedas, there is, with China, there is, with even the Maya, but some of the others, it's really a question of coming to the most educated guesses about what was actually going on.
Yes, because the thinking, the structure of thought, how that type of being processed reality as a human was different than how we are now.
Yeah,
It's just totally
absolutely.
different.
Yeah.
It's really interesting because when you brought up Egypt, it reminded me of a talk that Manly P. Hall gave that was recorded where he talked about how there were mystery schools there that had the ability, when you reached a certain degree of initiation, to temporarily kill you. And then they had a technique to bring you back. So then you had absolutely no fear of death at that point. Isn't that amazing? Have you heard that before?
I have. That seems to be a common belief in theosophy and kind of Western esoteric traditions. From what I can understand, from what I mean, I've looked into it, it seems to be an kind of deriving from like early Gnosticism and esoteric traditions from like Hermes Trismegistus and early texts like that, which were actually at the very tail end of ancient Egyptian history. So if mystery schools, cults like that did happen in Egypt, it seems to have been grafted on from Greece. So that's a better description of what was going on in Greece with the ancient mystery cults. That it seems that they had these underground initiation sort of chambers. They would prepare for this death and rebirth experience, possibly take drugs, but definitely psychologically prepared, disoriented, knowing that they were going to have this intense transformational experience, and that at the end of it, that would qualify them for a better afterlife. They would have the knowledge and the kind of transcendental information to negotiate the other world, and actually that would ensure that they had a better afterlife. So they'd
Right.
enter darkness. Within the cave, there would be some like epiphany, like a bright light with a deity that, these are like special effects that the priests would bring about to mimic the NDE. Um, and then I don't know if there was a deceased relative component or what, but there would be these revelations along the way, and then they would emerge reborn at the other end with this new kind of knowledge of what the afterlife was like.
Ah, that's really
So
interesting.
yeah, whether that happened in Egypt, if it did, it was, a secret that's still kept because we don't really have evidence of that. There were similar things for the pharaoh, certain festivals that they would have every few years to renew their kingship, and there seems to be a death and rebirth element to that. So
Right.
that could be a hint that it was going on.
Yes, it is part an archetypal experience itself, the life, death, rebirth. You could see that everywhere.
Yeah,
But preparing for death, perhaps some of these NDE stories back then informed the culture in such a way that they then shifted to prepare for death. Part of the Egyptian culture's ethos was taking your whole life, you had a great life, experience it, but also prepare for that next world every single day.
yeah,
We kind of, I would say, have lost touch with that. We see death as kind of this thing that happens, it's external, and we actually don't want it to happen to us.
yeah,
But Egyptian culture, especially the ancient Egyptian culture that you talk about in your book, thought about it way differently. They were
yeah,
preparing for that.
yeah. It was such a prominent, ever-present part of their culture. I mean, it was everywhere. Most of the monuments are about death and the afterlife. So, but so if they learned about death and the afterlife through NDEs, again, that's the way they interpreted that and integrated into their rituals is going to be different in different cultures. And Egypt, I guess they saw evidence of the soul surviving in the other world, and they thought, how is the soul maintained? How is that afterlife landscape maintained? So they thought the solution to that was to replicate it on Earth, and so
Mm,
keep the mummy sustained. If the
right.
mummy is intact, then the soul will be intact. So obviously not everybody's getting the exact same information translated into their ritual behaviors and all of their beliefs. But as far as like conceptualizing the other world and that the NDE part of it, I think we can focus uh, that focus, I think, has been emerges from the comparison.
Yeah, I think so too. I mean, imagine if Western culture celebrated death as a graduation versus this really
Yeah,
morbid, kind of awful thing. We
I
would have
know.
a different understanding of the brief time that we have on this planet as the person that we are. We're here for literally 5 minutes.
Yeah,
Comparatively, if you think about universal time, we're here for the blink of an eye. That's why
yeah,
it's so important to make the best and the most of your life, service, all of those wonderful things, because you don't know when you're going to go. And
yep,
you could be here for another 10 minutes and that's it. But the whole experience itself is incredibly short. And perhaps it's only a small step in your greater life, whatever that
mhm,
is.
yeah. I think that's a really good point. And people will sometimes say, "Well, I'll be reborn in another world, and it'll be a positive afterlife, or I'll be reincarnated." But that's still, it's not this life. This life is definitely the only life that you will have as far as this life goes.
Exactly.
So you're not going to have this life repeated. Well, although some people think so. Some people think that, we repeat the same life over and over. Anthony Peake, I don't know if you've come across him.
No, not yet.
He has this cheating the ferryman hypothesis. He's a really interesting guy. Um, but I don't particularly like that kind of model or the what do they call it? The simulation model, this kind of thing.
Mm.
It just doesn't sit well with me. I don't know if that's just a personal taste, you know?
I think it's just logic. You study these near-death experiences, you know that the spiritual world exists, and it's far more than we can comprehend as a human being. In the simulation theory, it's always put through this human filter of like, oh,
Yeah.
there's this computer design. Well, this is a human construct, this computer, these binary code. We made all that up. Like none of that, you could say it's through inspiration and there's a divine component, but
Yeah.
all of that simulation theory just really materializes, whether it's still energy, it materializes the whole spiritual experience. The divine is so much more than we can possibly comprehend, but we see expressions of it through things like the near-death experience.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's also that speaks to kind of the arrogance of the present generation. And I don't mean that to single out ours. I think every generation is arrogant about their own generation. Everybody thinks
Absolutely.
that the time they're living in is the most important and significant. But I don't think that like 4,000 years of spiritual, metaphysical, philosophical thought and experience about the afterlife is like dismissed just because someone came up with simulation theory.
It's just one of the many theories, but the information is so vast. The data, the amount of energy that consists of the multiverse is so much more than we can comprehend. And there seems to be a consciousness behind it. There seems to be some bigger awareness, some narrative that's happening that we can see as we study history and we can see it play out in our own lives. That part is really interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like I don't know, this is going to sound cynical, but wouldn't be the first time for me. But I feel like people are just people. I don't feel like we're more advanced than, other than technologically, also obviously. But I don't necessarily feel like the present generation, present reality, the last 100 years, the last 20 years, whatever, are more sophisticated or advanced in our thinking, or certainly not like our compassion, um, or spirituality, however you want to interpret that word. We're still having wars. There's still this really petty, divisive stuff going on. Um, so I kind of struggle to fit that into a spiritual narrative as far as like any kind of divine or spiritual ground behind it all, or that there's some kind of a grand plan. To me, it just kind of feels like um, we're some human animals, we're sophisticated apes who are here for this particular amount of time, and then we're probably have a new experience when we die.
Yes,
Uh,
absolutely.
it,
But the extraterrestrial phenomenon that
there is
prove
that.
there
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
is a component that proves that, well, if you believe it, that proves that there's something else out there. So perhaps we're bound by this human experience, but there is some element of growth that could
Yeah.
happen. Yes, we have the
Yeah.
technology. Who knows where it came from and how we got it so fast and how everything just exploded. But
Yeah.
we're learning from people from the past, from thousands of years ago.
Right.
We're reading those books and they hit us at our core. That
Yeah.
means that all of those people living at that time were just as valid, just as
Yeah.
powerful, just as enlightened, as learned as anyone here in this century now. We just have this
Yeah.
crazy technology.
Yeah, but the percentage of people who are engaging with that kind of stuff, I don't know if that's better or worse than it would have been 1,000 years ago or 2,000 years ago. I think it's always been a minority of people who think about stuff like this. I think maybe it is growing actually now with different podcasts and things like that. I think it's more on people's minds. There's more access to kind of esoteric information. Um, and that's one of the reasons for writing this book and for publishing it within our traditions. I wanted to get it out to
Yes.
a wider audience and not just an academic crowd where 50 people are going to read it and tear it to bits because I missed one minor thing or whatever. I think it's important. I have this real problem with like the elitism of academia and
Of
scholarship. So I
course.
really want to kind of put stuff out there in ways that are accessible to everybody. So I tried to write it in a way also that was engaging and accessible, and not get bogged down with like disciplinary arguments about the nature of terminology or the history of the study of the subject. really just kind of a more straightforward approach.
I thought the way you wrote the book was beautiful. And not only is it just like this deep dive into all of these NDE stories of these ancient civilizations, it's actually in itself a history of these ancient civilizations. You're not just looking at the NDEs, you're explaining their whole history. I actually learned a lot from your book. It was really, really informative in the way you structured it in the parts, and then chapter 8, kind of bring it all together. It's an amazing book. Amazing book. I really want to direct people there. I just got a couple questions for you. Okay. So in your book, you touched on this, but not really, you didn't really deep dive into it, or at least that what I read. I want to know more about the Laurician civilization of 75,000 years ago. Now, I've heard of Lemurian, I've heard of Atlantean, and even before that, but is that what, let me say that right, Laurasian people are?
Yeah, this is a problem. So that's in a part where I'm talking about. There's a German Vedic scholar named Michael Witzel, who is a brilliant Vedicist. You know, he's a prominent Sanskrit scholar and historian. But some of his ideas about the diffusion of myths. I was talking earlier about this idea that the reason I selected these societies was so nobody could argue that, you know, they originated in one afterlife belief, originated in one world and spread out everywhere. So Michael Witzel is saying the opposite. He thinks that there was like some root culture in Africa that was responsible for all of the world's myths. And they survived in this kind of oral form throughout history, and then gradually became more enculturated until they were written down in very culture-specific forms. But the problem with that is he's talking about people, you know, when the continents were in different places, and like when we have no written history whatsoever. So it's a huge, huge speculation.
It's a huge leap, ask. You're saying. It's just a big leap.
Yeah. It's basically making up a scenario that might explain something, but then it doesn't explain, again, why creation myths are different, why there's no set of gods that are the same in all these different cultures. It really is like the afterlife beliefs with those NDE elements. To me, that seems to be the only thing that is a kind of cross-cultural core of all these different civilizations.
Right. The psychological, neurological, and metaphysical components. That's about it, right?
Yeah. And I think, you know, obviously there's going to be similarities between one culture and another. There's Native American examples of like, if you eat something in the afterworld, you can't return. And that's exactly the same in ancient Greece, but nowhere else. So that's probably a coincidence. It's some kind of story that they were led to through, you know, similar kinds of narrative traditions or whatever. But that's something that we can dismiss as something that's really going to happen in an afterlife. It doesn't happen in NDEs. It doesn't happen in any other culture. So I think it is that. I mean, this might be. I'm very rigorous about this stuff.
So, I love that. That's huge. That's a huge positive quality.
Yeah. So coming from archaeology, you know, everything is about evidence. And that's kind of how I was trained. So I look at it as like, is there evidence for, you know, a diffusion of a single myth throughout all of, or all of myths, as Michael Witzel would say? Is there any evidence that all of myths of humankind were diffused from Africa before there were written records? And there is none, basically.
Interesting. So. Yeah, I think about the story of the Dalai Lama meeting the Hopi, the Native American Hopi. Right. He met them and noticed that they had similar styles in jewelry with the jade and the other stones that they were using. And he commented how there must be some ancient connection between the Hopi. And we just don't know when we go back that far. You talk about archaeology, you think about Michael Cremo, Forbidden Archaeology. He's taking it back millions of years. The Hopi's oral story goes back supposedly millions of years. But what do you think, after all of this research, all of this study that you've done for all of this time, what is the biggest takeaway? What is the biggest thing that you've learned from all of this?
I think that's a two-part answer. That needs a two-part answer.
Okay, let's go.
One of them is I don't want to sound too grandiose about it, but I think it's not an exaggeration to say that near-death experiences are basically like the forgotten experience in the history of human consciousness. I think they're totally neglected in the history of religions. Like, there's almost no book that you're going to pick up about religious studies that talks about near-death experiences as an origin for afterlife beliefs or as being relevant in any way at all. And in fact, like in the academic study of religions, it's everything I do is seen as like completely wrong. It's like it's anathema. I'm going against like every paradigm in the traditional study of religions. Um, for example, you're not even supposed to do cross-cultural comparison because the idea is that everything there can't be any cross-cultural similarity because everything is culturally generated and all cultures are different. So basically, there can be no kind of experience upon which people could base beliefs. So they're starting from this
Okay.
perspective of
That's pretty flawed, I would say.
yeah, they're starting from a perspective which is um, what you're saying cannot happen because it doesn't happen. I mean, it's a twisted form of logic. It's not based in evidence. It's based in like this philosophical idea that they're rooted in.
Right.
So what I'm hoping is like to change the paradigm of the history of religions, and to change the conversation in near-death studies. And I'm hoping that by bringing these discoveries into the dialogue, that maybe it's going to happen. But I've been doing it for 25 years so far, and I'm not really holding my breath yet.
Don't give up. And what's part two?
The next part coming is I'm doing a project on NDEs in Greece and Rome.
Oh,
So
wow.
rather than like doing a broad cross-cultural comparison, it's more like drilling down to see what were the debates about NDEs in these ancient civilizations. What were people who believed that they were real? What were they saying? What were their arguments? What were the cases they were holding up as evidence? And then also like how they were integrated into mythology and plays. Even there's a few references in plays and into the mystery cults that we were talking about, this initiation kind of cults.
Wow. It's really huge. It's really powerful. It's something that we need to integrate as we change as humans, as we evolve our spirituality, our understanding. We have to look at the information, the stories, the data gathered from these humans throughout history and make that a part of our religious understanding. I'm going to say to you, stay persistent, stay
Thanks.
vigilant, and you will achieve everything you're looking for. Getting this information out in this book is already huge. And I want to tell people where to find this book, okay? Near Death Experience in Ancient Civilizations, The Origins of the World's Afterlife Beliefs. Anywhere you get books, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, your local independent bookstore, wherever you go, you can order this. It's incredible. I highly recommend it. If you want to know more about this subject and you want to know in a cohesive, really easy to understand way, get this book. It's going to help you expand. Then, if you're still interested in Gregory and what he's doing, I'm sure you would be, GregoryShushan.com. You can just go there, learn more about him. He's on Instagram as well. He's out there. You can reach him. If you have a near-death experience, maybe you should share it with him. Send him an email. Tell him about it. And before we go, thank you so much for being here, Gregory. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with?
Yeah, I would say, on a kind of more spiritual, personal development sort of level, I think it's a good reminder that people who were raised with what they call toxic theological beliefs, people who think that that they are going to go to hell if God sees them doing something wrong, that they're going to be judged, that they're going to suffer the torments of demons and all this kind of stuff. People who are kind of wedded into a particular paradigm of religion that's causing them kind of distress and fear in their daily lives. I think my work and the testimonies of near-death experiencers throughout history challenge that. I think most of them are basically saying, those ideas are not what's going to happen. This is not just like a binary heaven and hell thing. There's not going to be, you're going to be thrown to Satan or you're going to be sitting at the feet of God. Nobody says that throughout history. So I think
Wow.
that's an encouraging thing.
It's very encouraging. It's love. It's a natural process. It's automatic for your best good. So, wow. Thank you again so much for being here, Gregory. Please hold
Jake.
through the outro music, and everyone get the book. Check out his website. It's absolutely mind-blowing. I've learned so much, just like you have, listening to this episode. And we will see you next week, Midnight on Earth.